Mr. President, I want to continue with a story that I began a few weeks ago. I stood before this body and decried the actions of the Fish and Wildlife Service when they had announced that they were moving forward with a no-action alternative in an area of the state of Alaska on the Aleutian chain, in the Aleutians East Borough, where the small community of King Cove, a community of less than 1,000 people, was being denied an access to an all-weather airport, an airport that could help relieve the suffering, the anxiety, truly the trauma that comes when there's a medical emergency in your community and you're trapped in because of the weather. You can't get a plane in, you can't get a boat safely to you, but there is an option, and that option would require that a 10-mile stretch of road, a one-lane gravel road designed for non-commercial use, that road could be placed through the refuge, on the edge of the refuge, to allow for safe access for this Aleut community to access the rest of the world for help, for medical help. So I stood and I told my story, and I wanted to update the Senate as to where we are today. Because as much as I would like to say that I was successful down here on the floor in encouraging the Secretary of Interior to act in the best interest of the people who live in King Cove, respect their safety, respect their lives as much as the refuge is being respected, then I wouldn't need to update you. I'd just say, okay, it was a good win for all. But the fact of the matter is we're not there yet. And so I think it's important that people understand where exactly we are. After I think this is now the 6th visit that the people of King Cove have made from King Cove, Alaska, some 4,000 plus miles to Washington, D.C. They were given an opportunity to meet with Secretary Salazar this morning. I've had an opportunity, along with Senator Begich, to get an update on that meeting. And I hear it was good. I hear that the Secretary listened. And I hope that the Secretary listened not only with his ears, but his eyes as he saw the tears of those people, with his soul as he heard their fears, their anxieties. And I so hope that the Secretary appreciates that when he says his highest moral responsibility is to the Native and Indian people, that he is then able to translate that into action, into positive action for these people in King Cove. What I'd like to share with you in the few minutes that I have remaining are some of the stories that the Secretary heard this morning. In the community of King Cove, which is, again, out in the Aleutians. It's about 600 air miles from Anchorage. It's about a $1,000 round-trip ticket to get to Anchorage. You say, why do you need to get to Anchorage? King Cove has a medical clinic. It has a physician's assistant. But if you have anything more serious than the need to set a broken bone, for instance, you have to leave the village for care in Anchorage. So you have to make that trip. So you've got a community like King Cove, real mountains, real mountains. It's tough to get in and out by plane. In fact, the Coast Guard, who was called in to do 5 rescues last year, the Coast Guard says getting in and out of King Cove airstrip is one of the worst places in Alaska because of the terrain, the weather, the wind shears that come off the mountains, the turbulence that pushes a helicopter down. It's just a bad case scenario. Fixed wing, helicopter, it doesn't make any difference. It's tough. So you have an option. King Cove is on the water. But the waters in King Cove are not always calm, and in this picture, unfortunately, almost tropical looking with the blue waters. This is the dock there in King Cove. You might not be able to see it from where you're sitting, Mr. President, but each one of these rungs up this steep metal ladder is about 2 feet. So if you are down here in your boat, if you have been delivered by crab boat from King Cove, about a 2.5 to 3 hour ride across waters that can be 20 feet high in the blowing gale, you then have an opportunity to come to the dock. And this is the way that you get up the dock. Only if you're like Lonnie's father, Lonnie was here to speak to the secretary today. Lonnie's father had double pneumonia, a 67-year-old man. They had to get him out of King Cove to get him to Anchorage. In order for this very sick man to get up this ladder, his son, who's right down here, is pushing him up from behind. They have a line from a crab pot that is around his upper body. This gentleman just had shoulder surgery a couple months prior to this, and they literally hauled him up. Now, this was several years ago. You might think, well, maybe things have gotten better in King Cove. This picture here is an individual being hauled up off of the docks in a gurney type of a sled. This is the dock here that he's being hauled up to. This is how we haul the crab pots out of the water. This guy broke his leg in 4 different places, was in danger of losing his foot if he couldn't be medevaced out to Anchorage. This is 2 weeks ago. So the technology hasn't gotten better. We haven't been able to figure out how you move people safely if they are injured. You've got situations with aircraft where, because of the wind shears, because of the topography, you have landings like this. This is the landing that Della Trumbull, who came back to speak to the secretary this morning, witnessed as her daughter, who was in this plane, is on approach, and all of a sudden gusts come out of nowhere, and this aircraft is pushed down, smashed into the runway. Fortunately, there were no fatalities. But Tricia, her daughter, who also came back to talk with the secretary, is so frightened to fly anymore that it's pretty amazing that she was even able to make the trip back. The stories are so real, and the stories are so now. And we think about those who aren't here to tell the stories. These are some of the individuals that over the course of years have died, whether in an airplane crash some years ago where 4 individuals died, whether it's Christine or Mary or Kathy or Ernest or Walter. These are folks who didn't make it out. But, Mr. President, what we don't have here are those people who are living now who have their foot, barely, or who recovered from that double pneumonia, barely. They're living to tell the story, or their family members are living to tell the story, but they are horror stories. And there is a simple answer, and the simple answer is a 10-mile, 1-lane gravel road with a cable along the length of that road so that you can't go off the road and go joyriding in the refuge. We're talking about a small community, less than 1,000 people, being attached to another community where there's less than 100 people. You are never going to have the volume of traffic that you have in your state, Mr. President, or that I have in the more urban areas of Alaska. We're talking about a connector road to be used for non-commercial uses. When a woman like Annette has to travel up this ladder again in, I don't care even if it's good weather like this. If a pregnant woman has to get out of town by getting on a crab boat, going 3 hours across turbulent waters, hauling herself up a metal ladder like this to get to an airplane where she can fly out and make that connection into Anchorage, When you put her through this, and you say, well, why is that pregnant woman doing that? You cannot deliver a baby in King Cove. We don't have doctors. We don't have anesthesiologists. 6 weeks before your due date, you are told, go to town. Town is Anchorage, Alaska, 600 miles away. And so when you're 8 months pregnant, every pregnant woman in King Cove has to get out. So these are what we're putting these people through. And the answer is so simple. So I stand before you today with a call to Secretary Salazar, a call to this administration. Listen to the people. Listen to the people who have lived in an area for 1,000 years plus, who want to continue to call this place home, and who are looking for very basic accommodations. Very basic accommodations. We have refuges all over this country. I got an email from a friend of mine who says, as I'm sending you this text, I'm driving through a refuge in Florida. Driving through a refuge in Florida. It's a paved road. There are signs along the road. It's 2 lanes, and it's a refuge. We're asking for a 10-mile, 1-lane gravel, basically emergency access for the people of King Cove. But sometimes I think that because King Cove is so far out of the way, so far, at the end of the world, as far as some people are concerned, that it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. And that maybe what we'll do is we'll just say, in this part of the country, the birds are more important than the people. And there is sensitive habitat out there, Mr. President. I agree. And we need to be responsible in how we protect habitat. But we know that we can protect habitat, and we can also let the human beings who live there kind of exist or coexist side by side and do it respectfully. The people in King Cove respect the land more than you and I can ever appreciate. Because if they fail to respect the land, they don't live. So when we talk about how we can reach an accommodation, the people of King Cove said, we are asking for a simple level of safety. And in order to gain this level of safety, we are willing to give up our lands. We are willing to give up other lands that we own in exchange for this small corridor. So, Mr. President, what we're effectively talking about, this trade, this land conveyance exchange that we signed off on in 2009, it's a 300-to-1 exchange. The federal government gets 300 times more than the Aleuts get. 300 times more, 56,000 plus acres are going to the federal government. This will be the first new wilderness that is created in Alaska since Anilka back in the 1980s. And what is being asked for is this small corridor. It's basically 206 acres, all told. And yet, the Fish and Wildlife Service says, nope, 300-to-1 isn't good enough for us. They say, we think that there's other alternatives. They say, well, why can't you just have a ferry? Put a ferry out there, a lightweight aluminum ferry. And you know what the Fish and Wildlife Service did? They actually went out, when they were looking at this EIS, they actually went out and decided that they were going to cost out what an aluminum ferry might cost. And so when they sat down with me, when the director of Fish and Wildlife sits down with me, he says, Senator, there's another alternative out there. Well, talk to the people of King Cove about how viable an across-water alternative is when, during the wintertime, you can't get into these areas because it's all iced over. You can't get into that. Talk to the people about King Cove, about what it means to be very sick, to have double pneumonia, to be 8.5 months pregnant, to have broken bones and broken body, and have to fight 20-foot waves for 3 hours and then climb up a ladder like you've just seen in these elements to get to an all-weather airport that can take you safely to Anchorage. And all they're asking for is 10 miles of a gravel road. I have suggested, Mr. President, I've suggested this to the Secretary, I've suggested this to the President's nominee to be Secretary of the Interior, that sometimes I think there's a double standard, that we allow things to go on in other parts of the country, but in Alaska, it's going to be a different standard up there. The standard for the safety of an American should never, never be changed. It should not be higher for someone in the eastern part of the country than it is for somebody out in King Cove. We're talking about the safety of Americans with a reasonable alternative. We shouldn't be having to fight our government this way, but the people of King Cove are willing to travel all this way to make their case. I thank the Secretary for hearing them out. I think this Secretary is a compassionate man. And my hope is that when he looked in their eyes and he heard their stories, that his heart will be moved to respect the people of King Cove, to respect the Alaska Natives, to respect them as much as he has shown respect for the public lands that he has been entrusted to for these past 4 years. So he's got an opportunity to issue this best interest findings and to reverse the decision from the Fish and Wildlife Service that says that no action is the way we go forward. Well, Mr. President, no action compromises the safety of these Americans. That's not acceptable. We'll keep working this, we'll keep fighting it, but I believe that in the end, right will prevail and the people of King Cove will have their safety.